There's nothing more exhilarating than pointing out the shortcomings of others, is there?
This video is made possible due to those who support me on Patreon. I'd like to give a big shout out to patrons Conrad Truitt, Dan Ray, Duchess, Flake, Frame by Frame, Joseph Abrams, Kyle Kramer, Majin Wiebe, Mariah, Sophia Narwitz, and Stephen Dillon. Thank you all for your support. Today, Saving Private Ryan is considered one of the greatest of all war films, and to some, one of the greatest films ever made. If you were to ask me if Saving Private Ryan is an excellent film, I would say absolutely. However, after giving the film a recent rewatch, I have some feelings. I've seen the film countless times over the years, and despite having admired it a great deal, there was always something off about it that I really couldn't put my finger on, that is, until now. Just to be clear, I am not saying it is a bad film. On the contrary, I would argue that Saving Private Ryan is such an incredible feat of filmmaking brilliance that it conceals the fact that thematically, it's a bit of a clusterfuck. I'm sure some of you are skeptical as hell right now, so without further ado, let's just jump right into it. The film opens with an elder James Ryan at the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial before we jump back to June 6, 1944 for the Omaha Beach landing sequence. I have no complaints here. The battle sequence is one of the most memorable in film history, and rightfully so. But following said sequence, things go off the rails very quickly. A few days later, the U.S. War Department learns that the three brothers of Private James Francis Ryan have been killed in combat. Thus, the top brass sends Captain Miller and his squad into war-torn Normandy to find him so he can be sent home. The film was inspired by the true story of the Nyland brothers, Edward, Preston, Robert, and Frederick, who all served during World War II. Preston and Robert were killed in action shortly following the Normandy invasion. 3 weeks earlier, Edward was shot down over Burma and taken as a POW by the Japanese, but was presumed dead. Thus, Frederick, the last surviving Nyland brother, or at least thought to be at the time, was sent home. Thankfully, Edward was liberated following the end of the war and returned home as well. At first glance, I can see how one would think this makes for a brilliant cinematic setup. A squad being sent behind enemy lines on a daringly heroic rescue mission offers plenty of opportunity for dramatic conflict. But then you think about it for like 5 seconds and realize it's the most absurd thing you've ever heard, considering in what conceptual reality would this ever happen? How does it make any sense to send an 8-man squad behind enemy lines to find a single paratrooper when they have no idea where he is or if he is even alive? The fact that the higher-ups would even take the time to address such a minute issue, let alone utilize that much manpower to embark on such a logistically absurd mission, is simply insanity. But wait, I thought you said the film was inspired by a true story. It is. Keyword, inspired. 9 days after being dropped into Normandy, Frederick arrived at the 82nd Airborne Division to visit his brother Robert, when he learned he had been killed on D-Day. In despair, Frederick sought comfort from a chaplain by the name of Father Francis Sampson, who agreed to assist Frederick in finding his brother's grave. Sadly, during their search, Frederick and Father Sampson came across the graves of both Robert and Preston, and thus, believing Frederick was the last surviving Nyland brother, it was Father Sampson who arranged to have Frederick be sent home. There was no rescue mission, no squad sent to find him. Had Father Sampson not notified the War Department, I doubt they would have realized the situation anytime soon or made any substantial effort to locate Frederick. And I don't mean that as an affront. This was right after the invasion of Normandy. Suffice to say, they had a lot of shit on their plate. Right about now, you may be thinking I am just being a contrarian piece of shit looking to criticize a universally beloved film to garner hate clicks, thus generating that sweet, sweet ad revenue. And
you are correct.
But aside from that, you also may be thinking that my contention is bunk because in the film, the squad constantly points out the nonsensical nature of their mission. And this is the entire problem. See, if the film simply used the mission to find Ryan as the inciting incident and let it be, I'd probably be okay with that. I have enjoyed other war films such as The Hurt Locker or The Deer Hunter, despite them having their fair share of inaccuracies, as they sought to emulate the experience soldiers go through on a more visceral level. They are first and foremost seeking emotional impact, and sacrificing some accuracy for dramatic effect, within reason of course, is fine by me. So the fact that the nature of the mission is frankly quite absurd isn't a huge deal. The problem is that the squad members are completely aware of and never stop bringing up the fact that their mission is in fact quite absurd. The odds of them finding Ryan at all, dead or alive, are slim to none. That is, even if they make it a mile into the French countryside before getting mowed down. Even if by some miracle they do find Ryan alive, what are the odds of them getting him back to HQ without him getting killed? And even if a single member of the squad is killed, which by the end of the film 6 are, 2 before they even find Ryan, it's basically a wash. So what was even the point? What makes Ryan's life more valuable than any of theirs? Now, this is where some of you may be saying, dude, what the fuck? This is the entire point. The film draws attention to the absurdity of the mission to demonstrate that the life of one man isn't inherently more valuable than another. It's meant to point out the senselessness of war by critiquing the incompetence of the top brass. Many classic war films utilize this narrative framing. Paths of Glory, Dr. Strangelove, Catch-22, even Apocalypse Now and Full Metal Jacket to an extent. Rather than simply making a blanket war is bad statement, the actual text of these films focuses its critique at the bureaucrats who are waging said war, often with disregard for the men under their command and motivated both by their own hubris and the desire to alleviate themselves of any accountability or unflattering perception. After the War Department realizes 3 of the 4 Ryan brothers were killed, U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall makes a decision to send Miller's squad to find Ryan. Okay, so General Marshall is the villain in this scenario, right? The bureaucrat who makes a tactically ridiculous decision demonstrating disregard for the soldiers under his command, driven by his own ego and hubris, right? Well, no, not really. In the scene where Marshall makes said decision, it isn't framed as irresponsible, but on the contrary, as if he is choosing the correct and noble course of action. Another higher-up even is straight up like, this is nonsensical and not a valuable allocation of manpower. And Marshall rebuts him by reading the Bixby letter, which basically amounts to him just saying,
"Isn't that sad?"
And it is here we see the film's thematic dissonance on display. It simultaneously frames the mission to find Ryan as valiantly noble and yet ridiculously nonsensical. At first I thought said dissonance was meant to entice some deeper philosophical debate, make the audience ponder if a particular mission's prospective value outweighs its inherent risk. But when it comes to the mission to save Ryan, there really is no debate here. You have one side saying, this is completely ridiculous, a waste of valuable manpower, and the odds of succeeding are minuscule. And the other saying, but it's really, really sad. Like, sure, but so is Caparzo pleading with his squad mates to send a letter to his father as he is dying, or Wade calling out for his mother as he slowly bleeds out. But regardless, in the military especially, you don't make decisions based on whether or not something is sad. It is paramount that tactical decisions are made objectively and impartially. In this case, the risk versus reward ratio isn't even questionable. Now, as for why this blatant dissonance doesn't stand out all that much, I attest it is as a result of Spielberg's filmmaking craft, which employs an abundance of sweeping emotion to sell, if you will, the premise to the audience. Marshall reciting the Bixby letter with passion, paired with the film's moving score, and especially the scene where Mrs. Ryan receives word of the deaths of her sons. Her stepping out onto the porch, a photo of her boys in the foreground, not even seeing her expression as she sees the priest exit the car and slowly collapses. In an instant, her entire world shattering to pieces. You motherfucker. Spielberg's use of raw cinematic power sells the ever-loving fuck out of this setup, and is successful in making the audience overlook what I would say is clearly a half-baked premise. Emotionality aside, I find it baffling that the film makes it seem as if Marshall making the call to fetch Ryan is out of some moral, patriotic obligation, when, if a mission like this were ever sanctioned, it most likely would have been done to avoid a PR nightmare. While the sole survivor policy wasn't officially put into place until 1948, prior to this, there was sort of an unofficial policy to send the last surviving member of a family serving in the military home, and this was primarily as a result of the fate of the Sullivan brothers. The Sullivan brothers, Al, Frank, George, Joe, and Matt all served in the Navy during World War II and requested they be stationed together. While the Navy had a loose policy of keeping siblings separate, the brothers were allowed to serve together, and their story was used as a recruiting tool, their faces plastered on newspapers across the nation as a symbol of patriotic duty. The brothers were serving together on the USS Juno when on November 13, 1942, the ship was sunk by Japanese torpedoes. 687 men perished, including all 5 Sullivan brothers. Sure enough, this was quite the shock to the nation. However, the Navy used the tragedy to garner more support for the war effort, even releasing a feature film about the brothers, all of which I personally find to be in poor taste when you consider the events that directly followed the sinking of the USS Juno. Of the nearly 700 men aboard the ship when it was sunk, somewhere between 100 to 200 of those men survived the attack and were left to wait for help in the open water. And due to a disgraceful display of military miscommunication and incompetence, no deliberate aid was sent until a week later. When help had finally arrived, there were only 10 survivors. While Frank, Joe, and Matt were said to have been killed during the torpedo attack, Al and George were among those who survived and awaited rescue. Al was believed to have died roughly a day following the sinking, while George survived for 4 or 5 days. Survivors reported that George was constantly calling out for his brothers, hoping any of them were alive, before slowly coming to realize they had all perished. And then, tragically, whether suffering from delirium due to dehydration or out of extreme grief and guilt, George either fell or jumped into the open water, where he either drowned or was killed by a shark. It should go without saying that this chapter of the story was left out of the film adaptation. The Navy did not disclose the details of what happened to the survivors until years after the war, yet successfully avoided the fate of the Sullivan brothers becoming a public morale killer, instead crafting their deaths into a tale of romantic and patriotic sacrifice. The reason I bring this up is because if the film's intention was to frame the absurd nature of the squad's mission to save Ryan as a result of a lapse in judgment of the higher-ups, why not have Marshall send the squad to fetch Ryan in order to avoid a PR disaster that could have followed if all 4 brothers were killed in action? The film even notes that the brothers were all assigned to the same company, but were split up following the death of the Sullivan brothers, and Miller even refers to the operation as a public relations mission. But this isn't how the scene is framed. The way Marshall nobly recites the words of Abraham Lincoln, paired with the film's rousing score, it's as if the film wants us, the audience, to agree with him that this mission is of vital moral significance, which clashes with the blatant fact that it really isn't. Also note that Marshall recites the Bixby letter, which was a letter sent from Abraham Lincoln to a woman by the name of Lydia Parker Bixby, a widow who was said to have lost 5 sons, all fighting for the Union Army during the Civil War, to make his point. It is quite ironic that he uses this as a testament to patriotic nobility and selfless sacrifice, considering that 1. The letter was as a result of a clerical error. At least 2 of the 5 sons actually survived. There are even some reports that state a 3rd son survived and deserted to the Confederacy. 2. It is said that Lydia Bixby was herself most likely a Confederate sympathizer and hated Lincoln's guts. And 3. Many historians now believe that Lincoln didn't even write the letter, it instead having been penned by his private secretary, John Hay. What is extra ironic is that Lincoln's own son Robert had wanted to join the Union Army, but his mother Mary Todd was against it, something Lincoln was reportedly embarrassed by. In response to Mary Todd saying she could not bear to lose Robert, Lincoln contested, "But many a poor mother has given up all her sons, and our son is not more dear to us than the sons of other people are to their mothers." I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that if Lincoln knew that this dude used his words to defend the decision to roll the dice with the lives of 8 men to save 1 because it's really sad, he probably would have told them to get fucked. Again, if the film framed the general's decision as one made to avoid a public relations nightmare, that would make perfect sense and avoid this thematic dissonance. This could have prompted a debate as to whether the squad was working towards the greater good. Even if some of them died, is getting Ryan home and avoiding a public morale disaster worth the lives of some of Miller's men? I personally wouldn't say so, but at least it's something to chew on. However, maybe the filmmakers feared that this would dampen the themes of patriotism and honor that the film touts. Considering General George C. Marshall was the actual U.S. Army Chief of Staff during World War II and was by all accounts a man of great integrity, perhaps they didn't want to portray him greenlighting the mission to protect the perception of the war effort, since it might come off to some as somewhat self-serving. Or, since the film is meant to be an ode to those who served, maybe they thought it would put the military in a somewhat negative light? However, if this is the case, then that is very confusing for 3 reasons. 1, since the mission is clearly FUBAR, like, you can pile as much bravado on as you want, but even if it's not for bureaucratic reasons, Marshall is clearly letting his emotions impact his judgment, so I wouldn't say it's all that more flattering. 2, it's possible to make a film that is critical of the military while also showing it respect. Paths of Glory is a perfect example. The film is critical of more ego-driven bureaucracy, but also respectful of the principles of the armed services via Colonel Dax. And 3, because Saving Private Ryan does explicitly level criticism at the upper echelon bureaucracy later in the film. About halfway through the film, the squad arrives at a rally point in search of Ryan. They come across a pilot who is tasked with flying in troops along with a general. To protect the general, steel plates were welded to the bottom of the plane, which resulted in it crashing, killing the general and 22 other men. Now, this scene is obviously meant to be a thematic parallel to the squad's mission, a situation where one man's life is given precedence over others. The issue is that these situations are not analogous whatsoever. This sequence is a criticism of the weight given to the hierarchical structure within military ranks. In this instance, the general's life is deemed more important than those beneath him in said hierarchy. Thus, the added risk posed to their lives in order to protect the generals is deemed acceptable. This could be a fascinating source of militaristic debate. While to those beneath his rank, it is ridiculous the general's life is given precedence over theirs. But could it be defended on the grounds of strategic advantage? What happens when those in the hierarchy begin to question its utility? Is a soldier's duty always to follow orders, or is there a time when a soldier must put their foot down if they are given orders that might needlessly put their comrades in danger? I think it is evident that questions like this could make for fascinating dramatic scenarios, and the film does show signs of potential. But the issue is that the primary story thread doesn't display these shades of gray. Sending these 8 men to fetch Ryan isn't a critique of the hierarchical structure of the military, since most of the men in Miller's squad outrank Ryan. It doesn't serve as a critique of questionable leadership, because Marshall's decision isn't framed in any strategic or bureaucratically selfish light, rather as the correct thing to do. It's not a debatable military decision. As a testament to how well the film uses raw emotion to, in a sense, cloud the audience's perception of the situation, I always used to think Reiben was a spineless bitch, since he is the most vocal about the mission being FUBAR, but now rewatching it, like, dude is spitting straight facts the entire time. The film's dissonance only becomes more amplified heading into the 3rd act. Upon locating Ryan, naturally, derides the absurdity of the mission and refuses to abandon his comrades. And it's at this point where the entire philosophical debate in regard to the value of the mission basically gets dropped. Sergeant Horvath is able to convince Miller to stay and help Ryan's unit fend off incoming German forces. But it isn't framed as if they are doing so because they now see the value in the mission to save Ryan. More as if they are deciding to stay on their own accord in an instance of individual autonomy, which is cool, but doesn't really resolve whether or not the film believes the mission to send Miller's squad after Ryan in the first place was the correct one. The entire seemingly astute question posed by the film, whether or not the mission serves some greater moral purpose, is never really addressed and gets dropped very quickly. Following the final battle, the majority of Miller's squad is killed, and with his dying breath, Miller famously tells Ryan, "Earn this," which many have interpreted as a symbolic plea to the audience to not forget those who served in World War II and to earn the sacrifice they made to ensure their freedom, which is a nice sentiment. However, in order to make this symbolic point, the film is basically using Ryan as a proxy for the US civilian population as a whole, which is really misguided since in the context of the film, Ryan is not a civilian, he is a soldier. This is actually an issue with the framing of the entire story, evident even in the film's title. What exactly is Ryan being quote-unquote saved from? He's not a POW, he is a soldier doing his job. Miller and his squad willingly fought alongside Ryan's unit, but after the battle, it is framed as if those men sacrificed themselves for Ryan, which is strange considering Ryan was right there fighting by their side. Also, the idea that Miller and his men died to quote-unquote save Ryan once again perpetuates the idea that his life is more valuable than the lives of others. Instead of the final sequence being an instance of brothers in arms banding together as equals, in the end, it is still sort of framed as if this was all an effort to protect Ryan because he is somehow special. But wasn't the entire point of the soldiers questioning their mission meant to highlight how this idea is totally bunk? And then there is the fact that Miller tells Ryan to earn it. Like, seriously? Dude was given a ticket out of Normandy and he said, fuck that, I'm staying here with my boys. Motherfucker already earned whatever it is in my book. Then there is the final scene where Ryan breaks down at Miller's grave, stating he hopes he lived up to Miller's expectation. However, when looking back at the circumstances of his quote-unquote rescue, I actually think Ryan has every right to be pissed off at Miller and co. Just like Ryan in the film, Frederick Nyland, even after believing he lost all three of his brothers, wanted to stay with his comrades on the Western Front, but he didn't have a choice in the matter as he was ordered to return home. But in contrast to the thankful elder Ryan in the final scene of the film, Frederick actually seemed to resent the fact that he was forced to return home. Said his daughter Kate of her father about being sent home from the front lines, he told us, girls, never forget that it took a presidential congressional order to get me out of France. To expand on the idea that Ryan should probably be pissed at this whole situation, consider that when Miller and co arrive, Ryan is given the choice between either abandoning his comrades or refusing, which, since two men already perished trying to find him, now puts their deaths on his conscience. But since the film implies, had it not been for the assistance of Miller's squad, Ryan and his comrades most likely would have been killed while defending the bridge, it is able to contrive its way out of acknowledging that had it not been for this setup, Ryan would have refused to abandon his post, eventually been sent back upon returning to HQ, and the entire mission to fetch him, including the deaths of both Caparzo and Wade, would have been for absolutely nothing. And then to make matters worse, another 4 men in Miller's squad, including Miller, are killed in the pursuit of quote-unquote saving Ryan. But Ryan didn't ask for special treatment. He fought alongside his brothers as an equal. Why is the burden of earning their sacrifice put on him? The symbolic equating of Ryan and those who benefited from the brave men who fought on the battlefields of World War II is muddled by the fact that in the context of the film, Ryan himself is one of those brave men. Again, given Spielberg's immaculate filmmaking craft, it's difficult to not get choked up come the ending of the film. Miller's final plea to Ryan, Ryan asking his wife to assure him he is a good man, even the voiceover of Marshal Ryan to Ryan's mother, informing her of his impending return, is extremely emotionally cathartic. But when you actually put that aside and just go off the text, this entire series of events is quite the thematic conundrum, becoming muddled as the larger thematic intentions conflict with what is actually happening in the context of the film. Now, right about now, you may be curious as to how this came to pass. Why is the film such a minefield of contradictory and confusing contentions? Well, while I can't say for sure, I do have a theory. And in order to explain, we need to take a look at an early draft of the Saving Private Ryan script one can find online. I advise giving it a read as it is interesting to note the differences between the page and the finished film. Caparzo and Mellish are removed entirely. There is a whole sequence cut where after the squad sets off on their mission, they outrun mortar fire in a Jeep. You can actually see the squad on the Jeep in the final film as they are leaving Omaha Beach. Their stop at the rally point is missing from the script. In the script, there is a short scene where the squad comes across a French farmer whose family took in a wounded paratrooper, but both the family and the paratrooper were executed by the Germans, which was not in the final film. The entire Steamboat Willie subplot is omitted. Miller actually survives the final battle while Upham is killed. So yeah, some pretty substantial changes. But the biggest difference is that the original script is
Bullshit!
A cornucopia of cliche dialogue, flat characterization, and misguided old-school bravado. Just to give you a taste, remember the brilliant introduction of Captain Miller as his boat approaches Omaha Beach, his hand shaking, fearful in the face of death, the camera slowly pulling back, making him look smaller and smaller compared to his fellow men, communicating the helplessness he feels, knowing the men under his command are moments away from being slaughtered by machine gun fire? Yeah, so in the script, Miller is introduced as relaxed and battle-hardened, smiling, proceeds to light a cigar by striking a match on a fellow soldier's helmet, I fuck you not, and then when a horrified young soldier asks Miller if they are all about to die, Miller says, hell no, 2/3 tops. Like maybe this was meant as an attempt at gallows humor, but at least on the page it doesn't come off as such. It comes off as more of a Marvel quip, quippy quip. Despite having some depth, Miller is mostly a cliche John Wayne type. It should go without saying, how Miller is written on the page pales in comparison to the subdued portrayal of the character by Hanks. It also didn't seem too concerned with technical accuracy, but egregiously so. In the scene where Jackson kills the sniper in the bell tower, in the script, Jackson notes that the tower is 4,200 yards away. To put in perspective, the record for the longest confirmed sniper kill at the time of the film's release was 2,500 yards. And even to this day, the record is only 3,871 yards. And that was most likely a once-in-a-millennium shot with a TAC-50, not an M1903 Springfield. But cliche and inaccuracy aside, the most striking aspect about the OG script is that, despite being penned in the late 90s, even with the precedent of countless films that portray warfare in a nuanced and complex light, it reads like a subpar World War II era recruitment film. It's not full-on propaganda, but it's very propaganda-ish, with an explicit America fuck yeah tone. All the scenes in the finished film that do frame either the military or the soldiers in any sort of negative or even questionably gray light were not present in this draft. The scene where Marshall makes the decision to send the squad to find Ryan is somehow even worse. No one even notes how unlikely the mission is to succeed, and everyone is down without a second thought. The squad does question their mission, but once they get to Ramel, there is another cliche scene where they one by one all agree to stay with Ryan, as if they have finally come to see that the completely insane mission they were sent on actually was their patriotic duty, and that General Marshall made the right call all along. Thus, the script is devoid of any sort of introspection about the military establishment and is utterly one-note. But then again, I don't really think screenwriter Robert Rodat was all that concerned with making some astute statement. I think he just kind of wanted to make an action film with a World War II setting. To put in perspective, he also penned The Patriot a few years later, so yeah, should give you an idea of what I mean. Now, when Spielberg got his hands on the script, it seems he was more interested in making a film that celebrated and honored those who fought and died on the battlefields of World War II, to accurately portray the horrors they faced, the courage and camaraderie they displayed, and to ensure their sacrifice was not forgotten. And on that front, the film succeeds in rousing fashion. However, because Spielberg's ode to these men is built upon the bones of a script full of cookie-cutter action schlock, cliche character tropes, and simplistic, unabashed rah-rah patriotism, this is why I attest the final film resulted in such a thematic mess. I don't think it's a coincidence that the film is overwhelmingly celebrated for its technical and filmmaking brilliance, while the actual story is often reduced to a footnote in regard to the film's legacy. But again, let me stress, despite my contentions, the film is by no means poorly made. In fact, after reading the script, I actually have a lot more respect for Spielberg and how he was able to use raw cinematic power to conceal the film's thematic dissonance. And the enduring emotional impact the film continues to have is a testament to his expertise. However, given this channel is mainly focused on the craft of writing and storytelling, as a writer, you can't just count on an expert filmmaker coming along and using their skills to slap a coat of paint over your script to conceal its blemishes. Thus, it is important to be equally critical towards every story, even if our personal connection to it may make it difficult to do so. As much as a formative film it was for me, I think I finally have realized what I always felt was off about Saving Private Ryan. It feels like it's trying to give a subversive, astutely critical view of warfare, as well as a heavily romanticized image of patriotism and sacrifice. Yet the contrasting mix doesn't seem purposeful or coherent, more like a hodgepodge of conflicting contentions. Based on the explicit text, it wants the audience to question the reasoning and logic of the squad's mission, while simultaneously on a larger thematic level, urging them to just buy into it via patriotic emotionality. To put it concisely, it is the cinematic equivalent of wanting to have your cake and eat it too.
Thank you.